Here we are, and welcome to another episode of the Friday Night Podcast. We have with us one of our all-time favorite guests. He's an author. He's a professor. He is the academic, people come to this podcast for our academic rigor, obviously. And this man is the heart of it. Dr. Jonathan Branfman, author of his original book he came to talk to us is UBU, The Kid's Guide to Gender, Sexuality, and Family, which is translated in 20-something languages all over the world.
I have both the Spanish and the English.
And I have multiple copies for my kids, but has a new book coming out that everyone has to read. This is amazing. This is sort of distilling all of the brilliant stuff. The brilliant stuff he said to us is just the tip of the iceberg. It's called Millennial Jewish Stars, Navigating Racial Anti-Semitism, Masculinity, and White Supremacy, by Jonathan Branfman. And the cover, just so everybody knows, this cover is steamy. It has a muscular shirtless picture of Zac Efron on it. And if you remember the first time Jonathan was on the show, he deconstructed the use of the image of Zac Efron versus Seth Rogen as kind of this basis for discussing masculinity. And I think that's informed so much of what we've talked about on the show in the last couple of years. And just to get it out of the way, Jonathan was also one of the brilliant people we spoke to when we were making floaters. And, we're really thankful to him for just giving us general insights on Jews and pop culture as we try to be thoughtful artists. There's no person we come to before him. Welcome back, Jonathan Branfman.
Thank you. It's really good to be here, and I'm so honored to be back on the show.
Okay. We're going to jump into the book because the book is coming out very soon. I know you can pre-order it on Amazon, so everyone should do that. It's going to be an amazing read. Are you doing an Audible version that you'll be reading in your dulcet tones?
That would be so cool. The true dream would be an Audible book where each star that I write about reads their own chapter. But so far, that's not in the works. If any publisher out there wants to make it happen, please get in touch.
I love that.
That's amazing. Okay, so let's just start with the book. The book, it has other stars on the cover, but I feel like this couldn't come at a more important time when I feel like Jews in the last decade in particular have gone through a level of introspection in the United States about our identity and not just our own identity and how we see ourselves, but how other people see us more than any other time. And this is such an important piece of the conversation. Where does your book fit into that conversation?
My book grew out of the realization that almost nobody, including most Jews, has good tools to speak about Jewishness and race in America. So, for example, lots of folks in America think of Jewishness as a religious or cultural identity, but then there are also all these physical, racialized stereotypes about Jewish bodies. And likewise, lots of Jews in America have white skin and may even self-identify as white, but then also can experience racial violence from white supremacists, like the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting. And almost none of us have good vocabulary for this, and also not much good vocabulary to speak about how anti-Semitism impacts Jews of color, who often are viewed as, quote, not looking stereotypically Jewish. And even though all these topics can seem so abstract, they're actually playing out in pop culture in front of us all the time on the screens that we watch. The movies, the TV episodes, the TikTok videos, the music videos. And so my goal in writing this book was to take the images of Jewish bodies that American audiences are consuming all the time and dissect those images to show people how American conceptions of whiteness and blackness and Jewishness are always intersecting all the time. And my hope is that by speaking about a star like Zac Efron or Drake or Alana Glazer and seeing how they navigate these contradictions on screen, that readers will have better skills for recognizing in real life how a Jewish person with white skin could simultaneously experience white privilege and racial anti-Semitism, whether those be bodily stigmas or even physical violence, and likewise how a Jewish person of color can simultaneously experience color-based racism and racial anti-Semitism.
Could you elaborate on this notion of racial anti-Semitism? Because right now, anti-Semitism thrown around all over the place, and there's a lot of, I think, a lot of people trying to define it. Maybe even some people who shouldn't be. But you're talking about a specific version of it here, right? Is that differentiated from others? How does it fit into the discussion of anti-Semitism as a whole?
Sure. Racial anti-Semitism is a traceable lineage of stigmas that envision Jewish bodies as physically different from and inferior to Christian bodies. And even though the notion of race as we know it today kind of came about more or less in the 1700s and 1800s, when people began speaking in kind of secular terms about biological difference or, quote, differences of blood or inheritance, the roots of this racial ideology go back much further. So, for example, some people trace the concept of race, including racial anti-Semitism, to the Spanish Inquisition, when, on one hand, in Spain and Portugal, Jews and Muslims had been forced to religiously convert, in many cases, to Christianity, but then there was still this notion that Jewishness and Muslimness might be some sort of lingering, inheritable blood taint rather than just a religious
religion that you switch.
And so folks may be familiar with the Spanish term limpieza de sangre, the quote, cleaning of the blood. That was a principle of the Spanish Inquisition. This idea that people who had Jewish or Muslim, quote, blood had to be rooted out or at least surveilled very closely because something might be wrong and nefarious about them. But then if we go back even further, there are many scholars who point to roots of present-day racial ideologies even much earlier. So, for example, in the 1200s and 1300s in European Christian art, a new visual vocabulary of anti-Semitic stigma started to emerge. And I'm glad to provide citations on this. I want to clarify that this is not my original research about European Christian art.
This is what we talk about when we talk about academic rigor, by the way. This guy's saying the smartest stuff ever said on our
anybody
podcast.
Thinks we've ever said something smart, it's only because we learned it from Jonathan. Like that's...
Yeah, we just
Jonathan, I wasn't going to question your,
but I love that you're offering citations.
Christian art history. I was just going to believe you.
But I mean, is when you're talking about visual, are we talking about like the awful what we call Nazi propaganda, but maybe you started before, like hook-nosed Shylock,
yes,
Harry Potter Gringotts kind of,
totally
representation of Jews?
Yes. So Sarah Lipton is the art historian who writes about this, that before the 1200s, there were these visual signs in Christian art of evil, such as wearing certain colors like red or yellow, but also certain physical traits like noses, beards, etc. But then over the course of the 12 and 1300s, these symbols became more and more closely associated with Jewishness specifically. So whereas in earlier art, Jewish and Christian characters in the same painting would not be bodily different from each other necessarily. Over time, those distinctions became sharper and sharper. And so by the 1300s, you have, for example, a French Jewish scholar writing a kind of guide to his fellow Jews on how to respond if a Christian asks you, why are Christians white and beautiful and Jews black and ugly? So that instruction manual kind of highlights the way these new ideas were spreading. And so in the present, we live in a time when in America, generally, Jews with white skin are legally categorized as white and often socially viewed as white. And yet there's this 800 plus year history of anti-Semitic racial stigma on Jewish bodies. And that history doesn't just disappear at the snap of a finger.
It was also their pop culture, because what did they have? Paintings.
That is true.
Books. Like that was their movies. So
right, like as well as theater.
Right. And then
we know how that turned out, Shakespeare.
Right. And then and now it bleeds into, of course, the pop culture we have today.
Yes. And so a useful way to think of it is that these older notions of Jewish racial difference are constantly present and grating up against present day notions of blackness, whiteness, and other racial categories. And so even for audiences who have no idea about this history and who do not consciously consider Jews a, quote, race, this history is still present with us. And a metaphor that I really like is the metaphor of driving in a car, listening to the car radio. And sometimes you reach the end of a certain transmission zone for a station. And so two stations start playing over each other, both very patchy, both very incoherent. And likewise, when you think about Jewish racial experiences in the present day US, there's this older history of anti-Semitic racial ideologies that is constantly playing over and against newer notions of Jewishness as just a religion and most Jews as white. And that's why you get this incoherence where people's explicit statements about how they view Jews in terms of race do not actually match up with how they envision and speak about Jewish bodies.
Do you see a version of anti-Semitism today, or the evolution of racial, now I'm riffing here, racial anti-Semitism, can it evolve to only classify Jews as white? Meaning, is that a form of racial anti-Semitism? Seeing how there are so many Jews of color and so many Jews of different backgrounds, or so many Jews who are pushing back against the dominant Ashken normative, bagels and lox pop culture version of the Jew, is whereas there are some folks who just slot us into the kind of white part of society. Is that a version of racial anti-Semitism? Or is that something else that's also maybe not good?
Good question. I would see it instead as an intersection of color-based racism with anti-Semitism. So on one hand, the color-based racism aspect is the erasure of Jews of color. And actually, a colleague of mine at Stanford, Ari Kelman, has just published a study on the way that, sometimes subconsciously, Jewish communities often contribute to this erasure through their own practices of self-surveying. So even the types of surveys that go out in Jewish communities when they collect demographic data, often the way that the questions are phrased sort of presume a white presenting community. That's beginning to shift, but it is taking a lot of work to shift Jewish community institutions out of Ashkenormative and white-centric inertia that has built up over a long time. So on one hand, there's this racist erasure of Jews of color, sometimes both by Jewish institutions, but also by the broader society. And then there is also an anti-Semitic impulse to deny that anti-Semitism is real. And one part of anti-Semitism is the notion that Jews who speak about anti-Semitism are just lying and at best being whiny and at worst nefariously misrepresenting themselves as victims to conceal their true economic and legal and media power. And so when racism and this version of anti-Semitism intersect, they can lead some people to dismiss all claims of anti-Semitism and instead just say, like, oh, those are just white people and they need to shut up. And that is certainly and unfortunately a common pattern both on the internet and in real life.
And this is why everybody, this isn't a chapter in the book per se, but this is why I think you're such a valuable voice in this discussion, because there's never a knee-jerk reaction from you. You always give such thoughtful, methodically built answers. So speaking of methodically built, each chapter is a different person, right? Is that how the book is mapped out? Walk us through how the book was mapped out and how you chose the different stars, because this is a pop culture podcast. People want to read about.
People want the celebrity gossip.
They want to know how each of these celebrities plays a role in your story here.
Sure. So I picked these 6 stars: Zac Efron, Seth Rogen, Drake, Delana Glazer, Abby Jacobson, and the comedic rapper Little Dicky, aka David Byrd. I picked them, first of all, because they're all very prominent, self-identified Jewish stars, but also because they provide this useful cross-section of American Jewish stardom, or I should say Jewish stardom in US pop culture, because Seth Rogen and Drake are Canadian. But they provide they provide this cross section of different Jewish upbringings, different media genres, different skin tones, different body shapes, different genders and sexualities. So for each star, these anti-Semitic bodily stigmas are intersecting with different kinds of bodies. Like when Drake, as a Black Jewish rapper, has to simultaneously navigate racial stereotypes about Black hypermasculinity and Jewish emasculation. Like early on in Drake's career, right when he was getting big in 2010, he had an interview with Katie Couric, and her very first question was, "What's a nice Jewish boy doing in this career?" And so her question conveyed,
the expectation. It was very revealing. That's a very revealing question of the expectations of a nice Jewish boy.
Right, and also the expectations of a rapper.
Right.
Whereas,
that's like when you deconstruct that question, like Katie's being cute, but not really.
Yeah, and even like so the phrase "nice." Oh, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, go ahead.
Even the phrase "nice Jewish boy," it's often in the present an ambivalently positive term. It can have sweet connotations. It's used in the Jewish community all the time, but it is a very mild echo of much older and much more vicious anti-Semitic racial stereotypes. Because even though we often think of race in the US as primarily about skin color, historically, a lot of anti-Semitic racial stigmas focused on other aspects of the Jewish body, including the accusation that Jewish gender is deviant. So in particular, a notion that Jewish men are emasculated and may even menstruate. And so the present day notion of the soft but sweet, nice Jewish boy is a very, very mild and very, very comparatively positive echo of this older and more vicious racial stigma.
It comes from somewhere. It wasn't just, no one just
wasn't always
made
a
it up one
compliment.
day. And it wasn't always a compliment or it's coded as a compliment, but it comes from someplace. And yeah.
Okay. Absolutely. And I'm really glad you phrased it that way because now I can't remember who said this quote, but there's a useful quote that our pleasures have a history, like our pop culture pleasures, what we enjoy, how we enjoy it, how we perceive and speak about these bodies. I mean, and not only Jewish bodies, but also when people look at J-Lo or Beyonce and have these assumptions about a certain kind of, quote, sassiness or, quote, fieriness or, quote, exoticism, that all these ideas about different kinds of bodies come out of a very long history and often an ugly history. And so my hope is that by looking at these very new images, that we can actually start to dissect that longer history and make everyone more aware of how that history shapes our thinking and behavior today, not only on screen, but also off screen.
Now,
fascinating.
Are any of these stars like aware of the book yet?
That's a good question. To my knowledge, no.
From Drake.
Should we just be sending them copies? How does this work?
I have wondered how the stars might respond to the book. I have not reached out to any of them. One reason I've wondered about it is that one thing I found as I wrote the book is that all of these stars are racial minstrels of different kinds, performing different varieties of blackface, Jewface, something I call Jewess face, also sometimes brownfishing and blackfishing, which are varieties of blackface. And in particular, I argue that all these stars perform a very subtle version of minstrelsy that neither they nor their audiences recognize as such. And actually what makes this minstrelsy so marketable is that it often feels guiltless, and that both audiences and performers get to enjoy these racial caricatures, including racial caricatures of Jews, in the guiltless state of not recognizing that they are consuming any kind of synthetic caricature at all. And as you may know, Drake has recently been in the news in this feud with Kendrick Lamar, partially because of the accusation that his performance of Blackness is, an artificial caricature and therefore insulting and racist. And it is not my intention to validate any sort of, what's the right word? Accusations of racial inauthenticity against any of these stars, because actually one argument in the book is that plenty of people perform minstrelsy about their own identities. But I have wondered in this moment if, for example, Drake, if he were to come across this argument that he is a minstrel, might take it very badly, which was not my intention.
But you're not making I feel like there's a difference here. Like, I mean, you've explained it in this very neutral way. It seems to me that
You're not saying his
being
career is any
aware
less
of it is really
authentic or
being aware of it.
anything.
It seems that humor in particular, I mean, entertainment broadly, but humor in particular, caricatures are part of humor. And I think with Jewishness, so much, and I want to say self-inflicted in the sense that it's not really self-inflicted because it's part of society, but there are so many Jews who have written their parts, performed their parts. There are a lot who haven't, particularly when it comes to women, which is something I know we feel very strongly about. Where does the line between I am in command of my identity and I'm doing something funny, and that can be funny because it's haha, funny because it's critical, funny because it's just, and where it's harmful, or is the point is that you should understand it. And if you can understand it and the different levels that it's playing, then you've neutralized some of the harm.
That's a good question. It's very difficult to control that line between laughing at and laughing with, or that line between comedy, which challenges inequality, and comedy, which reinforces inequality. And so, for example, thinking of a non-Jewish performer, I believe Dave Chappelle has spoken about his internal tension as a Black performer, not being sure whether white audiences were in fact just being validated in their racism by watching his jokes, rather than understanding that his jokes were meant to be critiques of racism. Also, I should acknowledge that Dave Chappelle has said some very transphobic things, which absolutely should be critiqued.
And anti-Semitic. There's Dave Chappelle.
Oh, yes.
Dave Chappelle. I mean, it's good to analyze him. It's good to analyze what he's said, though. Like, he's a really interesting case in all of this, right? Because I think he's one of the first people I knew of that thought and publicly mused while being very successful, right, about whether or not what he was finding funny was helpful or hurtful. Again, also has gone on to say some terrible things.
Right. I think it's unfortunate that he's now crossed into like a zone of just being downright like just offensive, and that it's not even fun to debate what he's saying because it's just. But like previously, he was in this like really interesting pop cultural spot of like critiquing and like the layers to it and analyzing it, and he's done a disservice to his own career and everybody's like enjoyment, I think, of his work, because it's now just offensive that I'm like not interested in going down that rabbit hole. But it is a great example though of previously how people like toe that line.
So in my dream world, you get a huge Spotify contract to do a 6 to 12 part series of the book, or based on the book.
Oh my gosh.
Maybe season 1 you interview the first 6 and then you keep going. But you have the opportunity to sit down and interview Alana Glazer, Abby Jacobson, Zac Efron,
but Jonathan was saying
Drake.
it might be very uncomfortable for these people to
let him finish.
Yeah, this is what I'm imagining, though. Jonathan gets to sit down and talk to these, have a conversation, a dialogue with these folks about it. Who would you interview first? I'm not saying you have to pick your favorite, but if you were kicking off, and maybe the book tells this in terms of the order, but if you were kicking off a series and you got to sit down with one of these folks first, I know who my pick is.
Mine is Zac Efron.
That's mine too.
Yeah, mine too. It should be Zac Efron. That will get you the most listeners.
No, but who would you pick first, like, to serve the overall discussion? I pick Zac Efron because I think, and I take this back to one of your original episode with us where you talk about how Zac Efron is sort of like, and I'm going to mangle things you've said, but Zac Efron in some ways defies convention of what a Jewish body and a Jewish person is supposed to be. So he's like very acceptable, right? And he gets put in a lot of roles that frankly aren't Jewish. Just watched a movie where he plays Ricky Stenicki, which I loved. And there's 3 Jewish characters. There's a group of 3 friends. No, only the redhead is Jewish, I think. I don't think Zac Efron's character is Jewish.
I don't think he's not Jewish. There's nothing.
Fair enough.
Like he could be or he couldn't be, but you definitely know that the redhead
who is played.
not
My point
yeah,
is
the
this,
guy
is
who's
that
definitely Jewish is not played by a Jew, which is really funny.
I-
Zac Efron's standing
I-
right there.
I think with the arc of his career, and again, I was just watching The Iron Claw, which is such an amazing movie, and talk about defying quote unquote, you know, Jewish conventions. But we know ourselves, Maxwell Jacob Freeman, who is in The Iron Claw and also in The Floaters and is amazing in The Floaters, and I can't wait for people to see him in it. Talk about someone who is sort of people defying the stereotypes actively in a certain way. So I feel like Zac Efron's, that's my pitch to start. But where would you start?
Oh, it's so difficult. I would love to speak to all these stars. I think one star who maybe is very timely to speak with, even though he's perhaps lesser known compared to the others, is the rapper Little Dicky, who is, as you would guess from his stage name, a self-emasculating Jewish rapper. I argue in the book that he performs a kind of Jew face where he plays up his own stereotypically Jewish traits, including emasculation. And what I find so striking about his work, and so unsettling, frankly, is that he offers this image of the emasculated Jew as a kind of vicarious voice for every white dude out there who imagines himself as the emasculated victim of multiculturalism and feminism. And so in so many of Little Dicky's performances, his little sort of frail Jew-faced character is being menaced or overwhelmed or wronged by powerful women and or men of color. And I would be very interested to speak to Little Dicky and hear how self-aware or not he may be of these effects. Because interestingly, he has actually made a number of statements against racism, for example, during the protests after the murder of George Floyd. And so there's this really striking disconnect between the statements he makes on social media about challenging racism and the way that his performance of Jewishness serves as a kind of vector to unleash all sorts of racist and misogynist rage. And as a follow-up thought, kind of related to the idea of breaking stereotypes or not, I think there's sometimes this idea that it is straightforwardly good or bad, either to break stereotypes or to really lean into your identity. And what is so thought-provoking but also unsettling about Little Dicky's performance is that his embrace of Jewishness in a really frontal way actually serves to stoke very ugly resentments against other groups, and sometimes the kind of resentments that can target Jews as well. So I would say actually throughout the book, one thing I would be interested to discuss with all these stars is that there's no straightforward connection between you're breaking stereotypes so you're good, or you're leaning into Jewish identity so you're good. Actually, whether breaking or leaning into stereotypes, either approach can potentially serve to unleash really beautiful feelings in audiences or to unleash really ugly and harmful feelings in audiences.
That summarizes Broad City for me.
Say more, say more.
Leaning into your Jewishness in a way that I find very disturbing and only makes people hate me more. But,
It's really interesting to hear that.
Because I know other Jewish people that watch the show and they're like, "Oh my God, I feel so
They're
represented
empowered.
in this, and look, we're so for." And I'm like, okay, I mean, sure,
But I just think what's just
that's
on
not
what you
me.
said before. I think it's interesting that it seems like you have a suspicion that he might be more aware than he lets on, possibly.
That's a good question.
Or that it might be not necessarily academic in his mind, but there's a commentary, there's this, a purposefulness to some of
Or he
the
understands the way in which
gimmicks,
it gives him an advantage.
So
it's a commentary more than it is just for likes or laughs or whatever.
Sorry, please cut my mutterings.
No. Don't worry. The mutterings make you makes you approachable. Otherwise, you're too
otherwise
and charming.
Yes,
We need you to. You can't be all Zac Efron. Sometimes, so you can't be all Zac Efron. You got to be a little Seth Rogen too.
Yeah.
So I think for many of these stars, including Little Dicky, my interpretation is not that they have premeditated their ideological effects or even their minstrel personas. Instead, you mentioned the term getting likes. And I think particularly for Little Dicky, who came up through the internet, that
Right.
he found, perhaps without fully analyzing the reasons why, that when he presented his body in certain ways within certain plot lines in relation to other genders and races, that he got lots of likes. And it's really important to consider that all kinds of harmful behavior can grow from just the pursuit of viral stardom without a deep analysis of why exactly certain jokes or images are thrilling audiences so electrically. And more broadly, I think it's valuable to realize both on screen and in real life that all kinds of racist, misogynist, queerphobic, and anti-Semitic practices can come from people who don't have conscious ill intent and who may even see themselves as liberal or well-intended. And I think it's valuable for all of us to keep that potential in mind, that it's not just some sort of faraway other who commits this harm.
Yeah. Always get me thinking.
Yeah. I mean, it's a lot to think about and it's fascinating. I just want to make sure we save time for Bridgerton. I'm just
Okay, let's talk about.
sure.
Okay,
Can we talk about Bridgerton?
we're gonna
Let's
shift
do
gears
it.
now. My wife has been watching Bridgerton non-stop lately, and I have seen exactly 2 minutes of that show once out of the corner of my eye, and I was like, "This seems like Downtown Abbey," but
Downton.
same thing. No,
But
this.
It's not. The show doesn't take place downtown.
I don't put it this way. I don't watch
in the
Bridgerton.
downtown of No.
I don't watch Bridgerton for historical accuracy any more than I watch Grey's Anatomy for medical accuracy. So this is
That's
not a
fair.
history.
Fair
It's
enough.
not a history
Yeah.
show. I just watched and I was just like, nope, not for me.
Because
she
you
was
want
not your
because you
algorithm.
want historical accuracy.
no, I'm saying if I
you're
were to
like,
watch
this is-
Bridgerton, my complaint isn't going to be whether or not it's
Oh,
historically
got it.
accurate. That's
Got it,
not
got
what
it,
that show is for.
Got it.
No,
But
agreed.
separately, like people being like boring is just not my that's not my style of show. That isn't to say it isn't. I don't even know if it's good.
Guy's not interested in the marriage mart or what goes on in Ton.
I don't
the
know what
ton.
that is,
The ton.
but yes, it
The marriage mart. Who's in
just is
Ton?
it's not my thing. And all respect to the people who are in it. I do love that actor who I guess was in the first couple seasons, and he you know what I'm talking about? I think he's
Jonathan
really
Bailey?
cool. He was in Dungeons and Dragons. He had a small part in
Oh,
Dungeons
he's
and
only in the first
He's
season.
only in the first season.
The Duke.
Jean-Luc, it's like his
The
name's like
Duke,
Jean-Luc
Simon the
Picard or
Duke.
something like
No,
that.
Yeah.
Red J.
What's his
Regé
name?
No,
Jean
he's just the Duke.
Picard. I don't know. The Duke. Just the
Oh,
Duke.
Roger Jean Page. Yeah,
I told
or
you, Roger.
Roger Jean Page.
That's
Yeah,
right.
that guy is. I think that guy's awesome. So, but the rest of it is not my thing. So I say that with this, Lily and Becky and Jonathan, take it away.
Is it okay if I jump in?
Oh my God, go.
Please do.
I'm dying to
This is
hear
our
your
Are you
thoughts.
kidding?
We've been waiting.
We love when you
since
talk.
the pre-show, yeah.
So I have been enjoying Bridgerton. I'm all caught up halfway through season 3. What really strikes me about Bridgerton is the erasure of Jews. And I know, as you said, that it's not supposed to be a historically accurate show, but actually, I'm speaking about the erasure of Jews from the show's fantasy of inclusion. Because something I find really beautiful about Bridgerton is that it imagines this racially diverse and racially equitable past for Britain, in which people of all colors and origins can be part of the nobility, can marry, can interact as close friends and equals. And even not only racial diversity, but also in season 3, there's a brief reference to disability diversity, that one of the debutantes is using sign language with her mother.
Yeah.
And one of the eligible bachelors is in a wheelchair.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Yes.
You're right. So in this lush imagination of perfect diversity, there's a total erasure of Jews, even though there was a Jewish community in England in the time when this show is set. I believe it's set in kind of between maybe 1815 and 1825. And even though Jews were expelled from England in 1290, Oliver Cromwell allowed Jews to begin returning to England in 1656. So by the time that this show is set, there were plenty of, or at least some Jews in England, many of whom were Sephardic, which would be a cool opportunity for Sephardic representation. And so it just seems like such a perfect opportunity to combine real world historical diversity with imagined utopian diversity, and it doesn't happen, and that disappoints me each time.
But are you at least relieved that they didn't like throw a few like Jewish moneylenders into the story?
Right.
Like,
So
I mean,
flip side of that,
have
I'm
nothing to have them as
on
the
the
money
flip
lenders,
side of
right?
that, on the flip side of that, what I'll say to Jonathan is that it's like a vacation for me. I get to watch and not. I'm like, you know what? Good, no Jews. Just leave them out. Like if you're like, I don't have to think about how they're being represented or how many money lenders there are, or like this is this diverse utopia, except for like the Jews are not going to be allowed in the club or whatever it is. Like we'll be the one people that are like discriminated against. And I'm like, you know what? It's nice to not have to
Or
think
like
about
if they did put Jews in, they'd have to cast them as being like extremely stereotypically Ashkenazi looking so that people would know it's the Jew character, you know, like let's just not deal with it.
And but now the way
but
you
Jonathan is correct.
said it, the way
Like,
that Jonathan
You are
said
correct. I
it,
agree with Jonathan.
now I'm
100% agree
annoyed
with Jonathan.
because
But I don't
it's,
have
like,
faith in
bullshit.
the creative. I agree with Jonathan, and I don't have faith in the creatives that it would be done right. So
Yeah, I also wonder how it would be kind of carried out. I do think one cool possibility would be to have Jewish characters of color on the show. You know, give us a character on the show who is a person of color and who's like Earl Feinbaum or something, or give us a Sephardic last name. Give us, an Asian American Earl who's Earl Abravanel.
The Duke of Elbaz.
Yeah, or just
cool
like
name.
have a menorah in the back of a ballroom.
Right. Right.
Or the Duchess of Bouganim. Those are all actual names of people we grew up with in Montreal.
But I think it's a great point because just the way I don't think it's ever mentioned, except last year the Sharma character was like clearly from India. They explained that she grew up in India. She was brought to England. That's the only distinction that's made. Like you could just have a menorah in the background because there wouldn't be in this utopia any difference between the Jewish character and the Black character, the East Asian character. It would just be like this little nice detail in the background. Because there wouldn't be any difference between them. And even this season, there's a huge class, like class is a bigger issue, I think, this season, but somebody from the lower class is like magically brought into the upper class. And as long as he doesn't work, everyone will accept it. So like there is some sort of like not perfectness in this world in terms of differences, but it's pretty light, like that people can just, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
So on that note, I think it's useful to consider that even though Bridgerton is set in the past, it is actually aspirational for the American future. What this show is imagining in 19th century England is actually a hope for what America could be one day. And because of that aspirational nature, that's why I find the exclusion of Jews so striking and sad. That if this is meant as a fantasy of what America one day could be, how inclusive it could be, that there's no thought of Jewishness. And also, by the way, no thought of queerness. Eloise in the earlier seasons, for sure,
I was
like
waiting
definitely
for
a
that.
lesbian.
Yes, absolutely.
And
I thought that they were going to continue that. I absolutely thought that. And I don't know what happened there.
I can guess what happened, and it's called heteronormativity.
Okay. Shit.
But yeah.
They definitely. Don't you feel like they hint that Penelope's sisters, Prudence and what's her face,
Hyacinth?
No, that's the younger version. Penelope's with two older sisters that they're
Oh,
married.
Penelope.
But
Oh,
which is the sister whose husband that I feel like they definitely hint.
Oh,
I think they code him as queer with the way that they make him so pretty and
Oh,
So
vague,
are
you
we
know,
saying
things
that
that
the
like
CW does a better
what
job
I
with
think.
diversity than because like Arrow, which is a TV show on the CW, I'm pretty sure it's Arrow. Yeah, Arrow had in its core team, not necessarily in the lead, but in its core team, you had at
Oh
least
my
one
God,
Jewish character at all
stop trying to
times.
make this about superheroes.
nobody
just,
watches Arrow.
I'm just saying people discount this CW, and it had queer characters for sure. Mr. Terrific being one of the main ones. You had, you just had the kind of you had John Diggle, who was the. I'm just saying that maybe the CW is doing a better job being aspirational
Probably. I
than
mean, yeah.
than Shondaland, which is what
But
I mean.
but I
This
feel like this is a really great.
what
show.
else are you watching, Jonathan?
an interesting show for Jewish representation and also just a lot of good fun is Ghosts. And if you
Oh.
haven't seen Ghosts, the American version,
Oh
I
no,
would
we
just
watch it. This is my
I
I
kids.
haven't seen it
my
actually.
kids-
I've
my-
only seen the UK one,
my
but I'm
kids have a-
obsessed with Danielle Pinnock, so
My
I
my
probably
kid
should watch it.
my kids are at the age now where they really have their shows and they watch them when they come out and we all sit and watch them, and Ghosts is huge. And I think Ghost did a great in the first season, I think, a great misdirect because at first Asher Grodman's character, I forget his name,
forever.
Forever.
Trevor, seems like a real dirtbag, and then he turns out to be quite a mensch. But now I don't think he's really on the show anymore. I think he must be doing something else because he's barely in this season. But is that what
And
you're
he's
talking about with
Jewish on
Jewish
the show?
representation? Yeah, his character is
Yes.
Jewish.
So something I appreciate about the character, in addition to this arc where he, is certainly breaking stereotypes about Jewish masculinity, but also turns out to be much nicer and better-hearted than he initially seems. I appreciate that he is so frontal and unself-conscious about his Jewishness. For example, the way that he integrates Yiddish words into his phrases, sometimes to the point where at least once, maybe twice, he'll say something and another ghost will be like, I'm assuming from context that that's good, but I didn't understand anything you said. I think most Jewish Americans, even though there's this notion of quote, quote, the Jews controlling Hollywood, the truth is that even when there have been Jewish performers or Jewish executives, that has not guaranteed any Jewish representation, much less accurate or affirming Jewish representation.
Yes, correct.
Absolutely.
And also, by the way, thank you to you guys for working to change that. I'm very excited to see the film you've made.
I hope you like it. Jeez, now I'm worried.
I'm very excited.
No.
But
you
Asher
guys
Grodman's
didn't realize that subconsciously you've created this other problem.
I know we
for
should
Jews.
actually include Jonathan much more in the process.
They really are in the process.
We don't get into trouble.
No, I'm very excited to see your movie. But Asher Grodman's character, the way he, sorry.
No, I was gonna say, just when you watch it, just so you know, it's done. So, like, be gentle on the notes.
God, I'm sure it will be great, and I'm very excited to see it. But I think in terms of Ghost, it's just like very affirming as a Jewish viewer to see a Jewish character who is completely unself-conscious and not at all like self-editing his Jewishness, and that he essentially expects others around him to do the work of meeting him where he is, instead of always doing the work to meet more majoritarian characters where they are. And that feels really good. And then specifically when he makes a shout out to Jewish summer camp, and he's like, I think he says, I was the 1984 basketball champion at Camp Ramah, and my yarmulke didn't even fall off once. And I was like, oh, wow, I don't think I ever played basketball when I was at Jewish summer camp, but I felt very seen, and that was a very sweet moment as a Jewish viewer.
That's a great detail. That show in general does some really funny stuff with crisscrossing, like placing people from different eras. Like one of the best things they always do is placing people from different eras, both against each other's eras perceptions and what was normal in terms of their stereotypes, and then dropping them into today's also and bouncing them off of that. And that's something I really love about that show. Did you watch Fleischman is in Trouble?
I did not. It looked too stressful.
It's very stressful. It's like a very
Stressful,
tense
I didn't
see it either. I
movie
felt the
about a
same way.
marriage falling apart. But
Yeah.
that's another
I
one
enjoyed it.
where even as the Jewish family within it made some choices that like I wouldn't make, you know?
True.
I
True.
felt it was deeply authentic, and it was deeply authentic, and it did not erase things that are far more accurately part of our childhood or our growth, whether that's reference to their, freshman year abroad. They actually mention Young Judea's Year course, which we are multi-generational graduates of, our parents, us. They have the kids being shipped off to Jewish summer camp, and they mention it and they show it authentically, but they don't hammer it in such a way. Like it's just part of the fabric of that world when you're dealing with this other thing, which is really this overarching issue of this marriage falling apart. But it's super stressful.
I mean, I think, I mean, I would definitely love to hear your opinion because masculinity and Jewish masculinity is definitely a major theme.
Yeah. I think I want to give a shout in that show. I mean, Jesse Eisenberg, brilliant. Lizzie Kaplan, genius. Josh Radnor's performance in that as the kind of dutiful husband, but there's like an unhappiness in his life is, I think, really, really fantastic. I think he's underappreciated as an actor, probably because he was in a hit sitcom for such a long time. But
right,
I think he was
authentically cast. Adam Brody, right? Like you got Eisenberg, Radner, Kaplan. They're all
and they're all really, really good. They're all.
Might have to give it a try and report back.
Yeah,
I will add it
because we've never done a Fleischman deep dive, so
Yeah, I definitely liked it. I definitely liked it.
And what are you? What do you recommend to people? What should people be watching?
I think both for watching and listening, I recommend the comedy of Joanna Hausman, who is probably the most prominent Latina Jewish star in the U.S. today, and she is Venezuelan American, grew up back and forth between Caracas and Boston, now lives in the US. And she has such valuable and interesting commentaries about Jewishness, racial experience, and national experience, because as she herself often says, she lives at this very interesting, unplaceable intersection in American society, where she is both Jewish and Latina, which are identities commonly not imagined to go together.
Yeah, that's our mom. Our mom was born in Venezuela, even though she's Cuban, but she was born in Venezuela.
Whereas, interestingly, I believe Joanne Hausman has spoken about having Cuban ancestry on one side, and that family then came to Venezuela. But
maybe she knows us.
I mean, chances are, if she's Cuban Venezuelan Jew, we're connected to her, or like maybe even related. Who knows?
Yeah.
But definitely we have some family that would know her, like grandparents.
Well, I certainly encourage you to check out her work. And a part of her work relating to themes we've talked about today is her experience as somebody who is not only Jewish and Latina, but does not stereotypically look like either of those identities. And, like light complexion, red hair. So some of her comedy is about what it's like to move through the world in a body that other people read as completely illegible. And likewise, because she grew up back and forth between Caracas and Boston, her American English is fluid and perfectly accented. And so, she lives in this space between white and non-white, and perhaps also sometimes being perceived as both American and foreign. And I think that her comedy is very thought-provoking, both for Jewish and non-Jewish audiences, and I encourage people to check it out.
Amazing. I love that. Thank you so much.
That's so cool.
Wow, that's amazing. I love that. All right, we got to check that out. Okay, we're going to name check the books. Okay. First of all, if you've got a kid and you want to have an intelligent conversation with them and prepare them for the world that we live in, the UBU, the Kid's Guide to Gender, Sexuality, and Family, is fantastic. My kids read it at a very early age on their own. They read it with us. This is a beautiful book. There's a reason why it's been translated into so many languages all over the world. Jonathan, congratulations on this book. It's amazing. But then,
thank you.
head on over to Amazon. Search Jonathan Branfman. It's the first thing that comes up is Millennial Jewish Stars, Navigating Racial Anti-Semitism, Masculinity, and White Supremacy by Dr. Jonathan Branfman. You'll know this is the book because of the steamy picture of Zac Efron on the cover. And so that's like an extra added piece. I admit, like, I have my whole shtick on this show about how I don't read books. I've actually done a lot of reading in the last year, a lot more than I can't say I like reading yet, but I now do it. And I plan to read this and buy this for people. I think this is a really important book, and a lot of folks have to have it. So that's my recommendation. This is a Shai approved book, which, if I approve a book, it's a big deal.
Thank
Jonathan
you so
Branfman, thank you so much for being here. Have a wonderful week.
Best talking to you.
Thank you. Good to talk to you. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Friday Night Movie, the sibling rivalry and pop culture podcast. Join the Friday Night Movie family by following @FryNightMovie on all of the socials and visiting our website, FryNightMovie.com. Our theme song is by What Does It Eat? And make sure to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.